You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this episode, I'm speaking with Neil Jeffers on Crew Resource Management, or CRM. So what I wanted to do in the episode is look at a working definition of CRM, why it's of fundamental importance to Neil, look at some of the history of CRM, look at the symbiotic link between human factors and CRM. Also dig into the detrimental aspects of what could be collective agreement. So we also wanted to examine some of the theory and look at threat and error management, some of the CRM tools that Neil uses and advocates for, and finally how debrief can be fundamental to improving CRM. So Neil has been a pilot with London's Air Ambulance for 16 years and the chief pilot for the last 8 years. So he's flown over 8,000 hours since he started in 1997 and has over a 5,000 hour track record in instructing and examining. Neil was also an experienced crew resource management instructor and a certified first responder and has been a volunteer emergency responder with London Ambulance Service for 5 years. Welcome to the podcast, Neil.
Owen, hi, nice to see you. You well?
Great to have you on. Neil, I just wondered if we could start by just going a deep dive into a working definition of crew resource management, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I think there are a few definitions out there, and I think I'll just go back to its title to begin with. Maybe it is the management of resources for the crew or cockpit, and that all sounds very, very simple, but actually there's a lot more into it. I think we tend to use this CRM to focus on the non-technical skills, but it involves everything, and the resources we're talking about when we're managing them for the cockpit are everything from non-technical to technical. In fact, I tend to use a very, very old model from the 70s called the Shell model, and it's S software, which is like checklists and SOPs, H is hardware, which is the controls and the displays, etc. The environment, of course. E is the socio-economic environment in which the pilots live and work. And the L, live wire, is the humans. So all of those bits are the resources. So Owen, to summarize, I think I'd call it a system, which could be training and assessing, of that manages the resources for the cockpit and the crew, are the two C's.
So, I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this talk with you, Neil, was because I think when things do get stressful, it's adherence and compliance and application of system. And it's almost this deep, fundamental, subconscious and conscious application to system, which seems to sort of get us through. And not only get us through, but I guess produce optimal outcomes despite incremental stress and adversity. Could you maybe speak to some of the principles of CRM and why they're so important?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. It is something we can lean on. We forget that it's actually a culture. And I think for pilots, the first ever exam you do as a private pilot, which is just someone who can fly people around, doesn't earn money from it, but it's just owns their own helicopter, for example. The first exam they ever do is human factors and limitations, learning about the physiology, but more importantly, the cognitive effects and problems that pilots suffer when they work. So it's always a culture within it. So that's the thing that we do lean on when things get difficult and hard. And I think potentially that the principles, and there's a fairly long list of them, of course, but communication, probably the most important, and situational awareness, which is the idea of understanding what's going on around you, much more importantly, how you can affect things in the future, and then the decision making, and of course the ultimate aim, I mean, of course, is improving the teamwork, which avoids errors and improves safety, particularly in aviation. So it's a big subject.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that error trapping later, and how we maybe do trap error, or indeed how you approach error trapping. But could you maybe speak to the journey and history for CRM through aviation? Because in the mid to late 90s, and indeed maybe through the origins from NASA, it just started to become abundantly apparent within the empirical research and within practice that these tools were directly applicable to medicine. Could you maybe sort of speak to how it translated through to medicine?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start with a little snapshot background of how this whole concept came about in about 1989, 1990s, as you've said. And the idea is that technology had improved so much that accidents were still happening. And if you look at the accident rate in around that time, 1980s, there were probably about 3,500 accidents per year in those times. And nowadays, I think in 2019, 2020, I think only 620 accidents have happened. So something was going on at that stage. And they looked at it and decided that, there was poor decision making, poor leadership, bad communication, all these classic things that we all talk about now as being the root of success. And so therefore they came up with this idea. And there was some industrial psychologists got together with NASA and coined this idea, this CRM, which we talk about. And as I said, it's a system of management, of training, assessing, teaching people these core skills and principles that help them overcome and deal with this more complex environment that we live in nowadays. I always attribute people like, who was the best example? Rona Flynn with the ants, which was anesthetic non-technical skills. So they identified, I think Martin Bromley also should be credited here, identifying, bringing the concepts and the principles of crew resource management into medicine. And I think that's where it came about. And for me, having joined London's Air Ambulance, as you said, in 1997, it was a great opportunity to watch high-performing teams, but doing exactly what we were doing in aviation. This is complex decision-making in really dynamic environments. And I think the analogy was clear to me. There's a captain, co-pilot, doctor, paramedic. So having these people working in these very similar environments, a great opportunity for me to look at, observe, and maybe try and bring some of the things that have been culturally borne down to me, having done it for many years, into that world. So I'm not saying certainly that I was the first one to bring it around here, but certainly had the privilege of talking to and teaching our HEMS doctors and paramedics the principles and of CRM.
So Neil, I guess my next question is around sort of the flashpoints of CRM. And I guess one of the things I noticed actually through longevity of working for 10 years for London's Air Ambulance myself as a flight paramedic was there would just be certain points in the day and or shift where the pressure would just be not even incremental, it'd be exponential. There'd be suction units on everywhere. There might be noise from the traffic. There's someone with a life-threatening head injury that's just fallen or jumped off a bridge, and needs an immediate anesthetic. But then there's other needs as well, building up to get to that. But there's the environment impinging, and there's almost these flashpoints, exponential flashpoints, whereby you need this concise communication, but everything is pitted against you within the scene to prevent that concise and collective communication. Could you maybe just speak to that from your own experience, either in aviation or indeed as you observe it as an anthropologist of the scene, as you see it when you land and you see the medical team working?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, what you guys do on the ground is complex. We love the idea of motor programs, doing the same thing many times. You develop this background skill of being able to do it without thinking about it. But what you guys do is really complex decision making under some really time pressure. And dare I say it, these are life and death decisions. And I think your flashpoint, the one that always resounds with me, and is the classic child under a bus idea, because there you see some unusual things. If it's just a person with an isolated head lying in the street, people will walk past and be mildly interested and film it as they do. But if you see a child under a bus, you see the policeman getting excited and shouting a lot more, the fire brigade turning up with kit you've never seen and working very hard, and our teams are in amongst it and trying to coordinate people who are trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to save the kid, but in this case, doing it in very different ways is really difficult. And I think the things we learn about it is some of the skills that we learn is how to manage bandwidth, how to communicate effectively. Communication is not just about saying stuff. It's about effective communication. That's getting your message, the right message, delivered to the right people at the right time and delivers the right outcome. So that's an important part of communication. But gripping that scene and getting it back onto a plane. It's very easy to be dragged along with the excitement, the adrenaline rush, the fight or flight response. Definitely lends yourself to your brain being full, your bandwidth being full. So understanding it and using the tools and the strategies that we talk about, namely in this case, would be just stopping everybody for a moment, just saying, guys, listen in for a second. Who's under the bus? Let's have an ABC. What's going on? Right, we've got a couple of minutes here. Let's just stop this down. Police, could you extend the cordon? Fire brigade, could you just step back a bit so we can get to the patient and just try to take control again and get it under control? I think the same thing extends to the tube trains. We have a lot of accidents, as you know, on the tube trains in London. And there are a lot of people on the platforms and a lot of noise going on, a lot of equipment going, and again, gripping it and then sending the right message at the right time. It's probably two key strategies to overcome these flashpoints, as you call them.
Listen, that's fantastic, Neil, and I really agree. They talk about these OODA loops, observe, orient, and decide and act. And so if the observations are apparent, the orientation is actually sometimes the most difficult aspect of an OODA loop, because hopefully the decision point and acting are never too far apart, but orientating the scene and that's really around making sure you've differentiated not only signal from noise, but what are the main priorities. So it's that situation. The orientation speaks to the situation awareness, which is, as you said, that single voice, that collective agreement, but a single voice that's heard by everybody, and a plan which is not far behind that single voice. But it's almost, again, this pattern recognition. I've been here before. I've been mentored in a certain way. I've got lots of information at the back of my brain. What's the application of that? And then what needs to happen sort of here and now, really. And it's really interesting watching people go through these. I'm going to ask about sort of the human factors interplay in a second, but just I thought I could just maybe ask you about when you see people's eyes and nonverbal communication going through these OODA loops. Do you see it on a daily basis, Neil?
Yeah, I think to a degree. Those sort of jobs, those sort of flashpoint jobs, you do see every now and then. I think it's interesting to observe that the RSI has become a fairly straightforward process now. We have a checklist, we have a process, and it's fairly easy. But the decision about making it, the decision about whether to do it or not, is complicated. And I think back to your idea with the loop idea, in that the orientation side of it, you've got to take the time to step back and take all that information in order to make that right decision as you move forward through that loop. So, and you do see the startled bunny in the headlights. You do see people, and I do remember probably only a month ago, where a brand new paramedic who was working with us, and just on their observer shift. So the first shift is just come to see what we do. And unfortunately, it's one of those jobs that requires everything at the same time. So it needed Reboa, it needed blood, all the access and the transducers and the coordination. And unfortunately, in this case, the other ambulance service teams that we were working with were under a lot of pressure as well. And you could just see two people. I remember seeing two people here just out of, the duck out of water, the startled bunny in the headlights, just struggling to just focus and getting target fixated and all those things that happen. And I think just getting them to just a step away for a second, I think that's something we'll hopefully come back to, is taking the time to step away for 10 seconds, clearing your mind, and then stepping back in with a fresh approach to it is a really important tool in overcoming those problems. So you do see it quite a lot.
Listen, that's fantastic. I heard from a good friend of mine actually around what they do on a ward round in ED. or indeed at the start of a shift, they take sort of 10 minutes for the next 10 hours. And actually, we can do that in a microcosm within hospital care and take the next 10 seconds for the next 10 minutes, actually. Like you said, step away, share the plan, and then go and execute the plan. But that sort of 10 for 10, sort of 10 seconds for the next 10 minutes. But like you said before, not be afraid to redo that, to re-step back, because the situation does change, patients change, the environment changes. But that 10 for 10 principle is actually quite powerful, actually.
Yeah, whilst remaining flexible, I totally agree with you. It's a good tool.
Yeah. So Neil, just looking at the relationship between human factors and CRM, and sort of the linkage, some of the fundamental linkages, are they one and the same, or are they succinctly different?
I've been asked this before, and I categorize it slightly differently myself, and I'm sure there are different ways of doing it. But I think the human factors is kind of like an umbrella term for the research into everything to do with humans, whether that be human performance or the physiology or psychology or ergonomics. Maybe ergonomics being the study of how humans interact with things. So human factors is a big umbrella term, and I think I've always said that beneath human factors, you can kind of split it down to technical skills and then maybe non-technical skills. So I think CRM, to come right back to the start again, is all about the managing the resources that have been identified through research, through human factors research, and optimizing team performance to eventually get to that state where you are trapping, avoiding errors, and you are optimizing team performance to make flight safety or patient safety as best as it can be. So I think CRM is kind of the management procedures and tools that improve the human factors study and understanding.
So just looking at some of the principles of CRM and like closed loop communication, just to make sure there is no differentiation or difference in understanding, but also shared mental models and indeed use of tools and checklists. If there was a hierarchy, Neil, within aviation or indeed within medicine, would you be able to rank order how you approach sort of CRM within your domain, or is it not necessarily that simple?
It's a really tricky question, and we're given a load of tools and a load of procedures and a load of training and assessment of these to use and have in our armory to use when we need them to overcome certain environments and certain problems and to improve teamwork, etc. But I reckon if I were to try and decide which was the top of the list, I've got to say communication is kind of key to it all. It always amazes me on a job when we're on the ground and you're trying to make decisions based on the information you've got, but the information changes rapidly. First of all, you get that tiny bit of information. It's an RTC in Croydon, for example. Then you get down and then you hear from the handover from the staff that are already there a little bit more information. Then you get a bit more information, and then the history, as all clinicians know, is the key to it all, is evolving. So communicating that from the person getting that communication from the person, whether it be the relative or the onlooker or the bystander, to the team, and then deciding what that information is useful and effective, and then developing a process, and then communicating it to the clinicians or the police everything is about communication. Everything is about effective communication. That's got to be the top there, dude. And I think from there, other principles, situation awareness, decision making, teamwork are all absolutely vital. But until you've got that cornerstone, that effective communication from that first contact of meeting in the morning, setting the scene, saying the right thing to your colleagues, and setting that culture for the rest of the day, to the communication we've just described through a job, is really the key to it all in my mind.
So just one thing I learned and probably guilty of actually, Neil, in my past is sort of collective agreement. And I guess what I'm notioning towards is sort of how do you air a trap? Because it's quite easy just to say check, or just to subconsciously glance at something without truly sort of acknowledging, absorbing, and sort of reflecting what needs in that what the need is at that moment, or just really paying attention, I suppose, is what I'm saying. How do you error trap, and how do you sort of circumvent this sort of collective agreement groupthink, so that a person isn't just saying something and they're truly reflecting back to you the right thing?
Dude, this is actually quite a big subject. I think this is complicated, and there are a few different approaches to this. First of all, I think this is probably a balance between the idea of joint mental models, which we've talked about. So having the same information. So a mental model, the idea of a mental model is that, nobody thinks about or assesses a new scenario on base principles. They base it on something they've learned before, something they've seen before. So your mental model is derived from previous experiences, and we all have different experiences. So we all might come up with different models. We all certainly on a job have different information coming to us at different times. So generating that joint mental model is one thing, counterpoised by the idea of what you're alluding to here, which is this collective agreement, which I might call something like risky shift, which is a principle. Risky shift, I first learned probably doing some leadership training with the Army years ago. And the idea of risky shift is that you tend to, in a group, the bigger the group, the worse it is, tend to change your decision making based on the previous decision. So I'm going to make up some random example here for you, Owen, if I may. If, let's say, sitting in a group of people, someone said, how many people in London drink London Pride, and other brands are available? And the first person says, I think probably 50,000. Another person might say 100,000. Then the next person is primed to say, well, I think it might be 1 million because there are 6 million people in London. So the next person, who was going to say 100,000, then says 500,000 to match it. And eventually the decision becomes a decision based on the shift in the previous answers. And how that relates to what we're talking about is a challenge, I think, because we have spent a lot of time trying to balance out the command gradient. And I think really nowadays we're getting better at discussing command gradient in terms of using it. So knowing how it works and using it, identifying it, but also leveling it and trying to get people to make decisions on their own basis is potentially quite tricky. I'm going to give you a clinical example, though, and so help me out here. You might be able to correct me here. Let's say we're going to a 45-year-old male, isolated, head injury, post-assault. One person says this is going to be an RSI ground escort to the local major trauma centre. And the other person says, well, hold on a second. He's a bit drunk. His English is not his first language. His motor score is quite high. So why are we tubing him? Surely this is a ground. And already you have a difference in opinion. So trying to balance this out and understanding each other. So the idea of doing it is in isolation, to making these decisions in isolation and coming together with all that information.
It's not being scared to have a plenary discussion, but not be above reproach. So I think that you're right with the information executed as a team in a concise fashion. It's not being above reproach. You're right. It's not being biased in necessarily just within your practice. So it's being open to other people's opinion. And what I really learned quite early on, it's this invisible gorilla, whereby there's things in the scene that you don't, if you're leading a scene, that you don't necessarily see. It's like the invisible gorilla from Stanford University, where they were counting the passes, and you don't see the invisible gorilla breakdancing halfway through the experiment, or 50% of people don't. And then they run the experiment again, and everyone sees the gorilla, but no one sees the fact that the background curtains have changed color. So that, and they said, did you see anything else? And everyone, well, we saw the gorilla. But what that illustrates is there's constantly things changing in the environment. And even when you think you've caught everything, there's other things changing, but that you don't realize. And so what was acutely and still am acutely aware of is asking, have I missed anything? Have I missed anything? And, and is there anything we should do differently here? And I think those two questions are hopefully fundamental, because it opens you up to your fundamental biases that you will not always appreciate everything within a scene.
There's certainly something about being receptive and the balance of being receptive and being assertive, depending on your position within the group. And I think being receptive to and open to differences is probably the most important thing. It's so easy just to make a decision, and we've learned about confirmation bias, etc., and sticking with it. But CRM, the tools of CRM teach us that there is stuff we could have missed. We do have a different approach to other people, and therefore you should be open to other suggestions and not. I think to drift slightly away from the pre-hospital care, I think another thing that strikes me on this subject is this idea of cognitive diversity, is having people that are from different backgrounds and have different ideas. So one of the things we try and get people to do on the ground, on a HEMS job again, let's go back to that, is to open it out to people and just say, right, guys, just stop a second. We're halfway through this job. This is at this time, this accident happened to this person. This is what we've done so far. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And we want to be out of here in 5 or 10 minutes. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any thoughts? And just allowing people to speak up as well, and just because people out there have seen different things and know different things. And I think it's so important to be receptive and open to those suggestions. That should overcome most of the problems we see with that.
Oh, I think that's fantastic, Neil, because that strikes me as being sort of open and responsive enough to change the plan if need be, because you do go, and I'm guilty of this as well. There's this sunk cost fallacy where you invest so much from an early decision, and John Chatterjee spoke about this last week, where you become so invested early on, again, to your point, when you don't necessarily appreciate all the information on the scene, and information can change, the assessment can change, the physiology can change. And actually this sort of sunk cost fallacy, whereby you've invested so much within your plan and you're so far down the route that you're not open to new information or new perspectives. And I think breaking that is powerful, or just at least giving people opportunity to speak into your practice, so that you're not steamrolling and potentially creating second and third order errors and biases down the line. Also, just something I realized that I was doing a lot of is this cognitive dissonance, whereby I would preach one thing but then very much do another thing in practice. And that was very much in my early practice. I think I would like to think I was probably a bit more capable than I was. And that brings us probably nicely onto the Dunning-Kruger effect from the next question. But there's this proclivity to think you are far more capable than you are. And, in my mind's eye, I would be all over the airway, be excellent at cannulation, excellent at intubation, excellent at everything. And actually, when the pressure was on, I didn't always perform, actually, truth be told, and was probably quite suboptimal in quite a few of my sort of performances. And again, it's not about self, but it's about team. But you'd like to think that you were performing. And I think that was minimizing that cognitive dissonance, whereby you know what the right thing to do is, and to slow it down and to step out and do one thing at once and to delegate appropriately, and then to do that on scene rather than trying to do everything all at once and doing nothing well. And I guess that does bring me on to sort of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And could you maybe speak to that and how you view that as a chief pilot?
Well, yeah. So remind ourselves that the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is this unusual sort of effect whereby people who are maybe less good at things study or do something, and they overestimate their own abilities, and that's largely because of a sort of a lack of self-awareness. If I'm trying to think of an example here, maybe if you were getting people to learn a specific skill, and you all went away and you had learned how to do 5 of those things in a day, and you thought you're brilliant at it because nobody else could do it, but everybody else has done 20. It's very easy because you have no basis for relating to other people for you to think that you're doing quite a good job because you've learned how to do 5 of them. It's brilliant, and therefore you might proclaim to be better at it. And that's kind of the idea. So are you familiar with the Dirty Dozen? The Dirty Dozen of CRM.
I'm
They're-
not
they're-
not to
yeah.
not to. I couldn't recall it. If you could, can you speak to it?
Well, I was just going to say, because one of them is exactly we're talking about the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is one of them. So the Dirty Dozen, it's a bit of an old thing, I'm afraid, but they are the things that they thought. This is a guy called DuPont developed this in 1993, somewhere around there. And so lack of communication, distraction, all of these, there are 12 of them, of course, fatigue, etc. But one of them is lack of awareness. So working in isolation, doing your own thing without the checks and balances of working in a team, can lead to this idea that you're doing quite a good job. And therefore, within this sort of the environment, it's particularly pertinent in aviation and interesting because we're all taught in the same way. Pilots are generally sort of slightly alpha in their outlook and think they're the best pilots, better than all the other pilots, etc. And it's fairly easy for this sort of effect to take place. So I think that having this awareness, having this understanding, being open to criticism, I think are the key areas. Now we've talked about this sort of this thing a little bit already. Just being open and receptive to people's different approaches and different ways of doing things is kind of the key to it, I think. And just being aware and comparing yourself to other people and comparing particularly your performance to the standard that's expected and the standard of other people.
If I'm being honest, actually, Neil, that's why I just exponentially grew so much by being around some absolutely phenomenally capable clinicians that had really good communication skills, despite the variation in stress and environmental pressures and clinical presentations, would show consistency of character, consistency of communication, consistency of skill acquisition and skill execution. And reach decision points in a very sensible, reasonable and calm way, and actually just carry this countenance of calmness. And I just, and again, this is nothing you can learn from a textbook. It was entirely observed and hopefully absorbed osmotically through just being around these people. And whenever I've flown with yourself and other pilots like yourself, it's having this countenance of calmness, whereby despite the variation in environmental conditions, there's a calm approach and a logical approach, and it doesn't need to necessarily be right or have all the right answers, but that you can work sequentially through the information and get to the right answer together. And I think that model to me, and indeed maybe to yourself, and you've seen it on scene, is powerful, because it shows you don't have to have all the right answers, but that you can embody and model this sort of calm cadence of communication and get there.
I think you're right. I think the idea, particularly back to pilots again, is so I could write a list of all the pilots now and go, actually, he's better at that than I am. I'm better at this than someone else. They're better, and you kind of get a sense, and CRM teaches us that we don't all brilliant at everything. There are people with better skills, and it's very humbling to watch you experts on scene and just see how calm and considered and all the stuff that you've learned by the many years of doing it, your expertise, about how well you can perform under those pressures. And it's really difficult but humbling and impressive to watch.
So Neil, just moving on, just looking at sort of some commonly used CRM principles that you use on a daily basis in the cockpit, could you maybe speak to one or two of them?
Oh yeah, sure. So So communication, clearly, we've talked about that as being the most important one. I think that's key to it all. And it's easy just to think about the cockpit environment, communication, but it extends, throughout the whole team, from the fire crew, doctors, pilots, paramedics, data, driving, charity staff, etc. And that's key. So I'll drop that off for the moment. I think there's a couple of other tools that we use quite a lot and probably should talk about. I quite like the idea of threat area management at the moment, the idea of having a joint mental model on the group's perceived threats before they become errors. And the way we overcome that nowadays is when we start the aircraft in the morning, and you might remember, we have 54 items on the checklist. But the first one on the checklist is threat area management. What are the threats that we see today? And we've moved beyond the basics. So NOTAMs, which are notices to airmen, so instructions to airmen and threats to airmen. The weather, they're obvious threats. But we talk about human threats now. We talk about, not slept very well last night, or this is my fourth shift in a row, or I had a particularly bad job yesterday, and that's still, or I've just heard a friend has had a problem, or so I think that's an important thing. And when we get to the roof, we have another threat area management discussion, and this includes the doctors, paramedics, fire crews, you might remember. And we get the sort of global idea of what we can expect and the stresses and strains that people are under. And that only makes our teamwork better. It only enhances the performance of the individual and the team. And of course, just makes us work to the best of our ability for that day. And the other tool probably that we use quite a lot, although I'm going to throw it out there now, probably starting to overuse a little bit now in most places, is checklists. I think checklists are not the panacea to everything, but they're not the answer to everything. So important, checklists. And I'm right behind Alec Gawande and his book, The Checklist Manifesto. They are a very important thing, but you can throw them at everything and use and overuse them, and they've got to be used properly. But we use checklists a lot flying, and the medics use them a lot, as you know, doing the RSI, etc. So they're the main tools that I think we use quite a lot.
So Neil, could you maybe speak to debriefing as a sort of fundamental part of your role? Again, debriefing has become more in vogue over the past few years, and I think it's become quite central to learning. And that's just, from a cold case to an immediate hot debrief. Could you maybe speak to it within aviation, or indeed what you see within medicine?
I might slim this down, because this could be an hour in itself, because debriefing, I think, is an art. I think there are many different types of debriefs, from the hot debrief, the corridor debrief, the rapid review, CGD, the debrief in the pub. There are many, many different debriefs. And I think there's a couple of important things. We have a little 30-second debrief when we land in the aircraft. I think that's really important, because we can just clear up any comms issues. So sometimes you land and you say, I thought you said we were going to this place. This is not where and no, I said this. Oh, yes, totally understand now. So just getting these little things out of the way and staying on the same, having the same mental model is really important. Well, I think a key thing that we should do better with debriefing is what went well, the safety 2 idea, which is, and I might give you an example, actually, if I may. Yesterday, I was flying, and we had a patient who had been stabbed. This was on the outskirts of London. We were airborne at 50 minutes past the hour, 3:50, and we landed at 57. We went over to the patient, who was in the back of an ambulance, and did the normal little things. The patient didn't need an RSI, but we put the patient in the back of the aircraft, and we were airborne before 1:15. Yes, that's 20 minutes on the ground up, and the patient was back on the roof within 7 minutes of starting the engines on the aircraft. And that was a really quick mission and smooth. And we went back and debriefed it, as we tried to. And I think the important thing, the point I'm trying to draw out here, is, why did that go well? Why was that smooth? Why was it quick? Clearly, we didn't have as much to do with patients but there's something about understanding that little things like concurrent activities go well. So we all agreed, oh yes, because you went off and did your blue call and the monitor at this point, that led the guys on the ground to do this at this point. So there was lots of happening at the same time. And we sort of went away and said, oh yes, so next time we could kind of emulate that. So my point being is the point about debriefing is it's not just necessarily the problems that we have or what went wrong, but it's also about what went well. And I think we're moving towards an idea where we've been trialing a 4D debrief. The idea being is you ask the group, right, what are 2 things that went well? And what are 2 things we could have done better? And the idea in that case for the HEMS team is to capture any immediate threats, problems before they become errors, before, of course, you go away, pack a bag, and you're on the road again. So taking that time to get together again, is important. There's a psychological element of this debrief as well, which is another massive subject. The psychological security of talking about what just happened and how it affected you, and then taking those small lessons or those small ideas to the next job is vital for high performing teams.
Listen, I fundamentally agree with that, Neil, and really like the example you gave there, because like you said, the sequential activity versus simultaneous activity is still a powerful reminder to me of making sure we are doing things simultaneously. So, but things within our swim lane. So everything from, is the ambulance pointing the right direction if you're going by ambulance? Is the driver briefed? Are the keys in the ambulance? Have who's spoken to the control room or the hospital? And but making sure there's no redundancy in the system. So again, like you said, simultaneously rather than in sequence or chronologically, because you're right, that slows things down, and it's the small incremental minutes and or seconds which start to aggregate over time and slow the whole scene down.
I think the debrief, when we walk away sometimes and say, you know what, I'm not sure we need to debrief there because everything went well. That's one of the worst things we can say. And the good jobs, the best jobs we do, are when the LAS teams on the ground are also so invested and work. We all work as a massive team really well together, and understanding why that worked well. What was the phrases? What did we say? How did we set the scene? How did we approach it? What did we say to break down that classic command gradient error we have? You guys can jump out of a helicopter and run across to the road and do anything you want to the patient. You need to sort this command gradient out, and understanding what we say and how we say it to develop the team to make it high performing, even though they're people we've never met before, is an important part of understanding how to get better.
Absolutely. And just to that point, as we come into land around sort of high performing culture, because the culture you bring to a scene, or dynamically to every scene, to every patient, is one of there's so many layers to it, but it really is around tonality, intonation, eye contact, and making sure there is ubiquitous understanding. It doesn't necessarily need to be ubiquitous agreement, because you want to be open to other people's opinions and information, but it's a microcosm, and this is what is so pre-hospital care is so fascinating. And you get a window into this, Neil, because you see this high performing culture, and it's different. Every job is different, every incident is different, and the culture, as in the ecosystem of communication, the rapport, the understanding, the sequence or simultaneous activity is different each time, and it's almost the aspiration is of high performing teams is to bring this high performing culture to a same place, irrespective of the patient and or the scene.
I think you're absolutely right, and I wonder, I'm going to stretch it out here and suggest something here, that I think instead of people with high IQ, it's people with high EQ that are more important in this environment. So being able to do the job is clearly important. I appreciate the physical item that you do is important, but having if we had people with the highest EQ possible, emotional quotient possible, they would communicate, they would get their point across, those subtle intonations of eye contact and saying the right thing and listening when you need to and transmitting at the right time and all that stuff would come together. And that's basically the whole concept of human factors and CRM. Is people that can understand and communicate to that next level, I think is an important thing we should do more work and to understand.
So as we come into land, Neil, just look at some sort of take-home messages that you give to listeners and people wanting to maybe indeed improve their CRM. Could you maybe speak to a few messages?
Well, so yeah, one of the key things that I do stress to people when we talk a little bit about it is actually just taking that time out. We talk about it. I think if we were to identify the ultimate HEMS job, it would be one where we took the time to brief as a big team beforehand and discuss the threats and before they became errors. It would be about checking the kit before we went anywhere. It would be about getting on the ground and before getting to the patient, taking a big 360 look at it to avoid any of the sort of the errors you might see in confirmation bias. So taking the time. I think it's something about clearly about communicating accurately. But what we do see time and time again is people do get overloaded, and it's not a surprise. We are doing much more to patients than we've ever done before. The complexity of what we now do is huge, and we do all suffer the human condition, and we can be forgiven for being overloaded and run out of bandwidth. So taking those little pauses to step back and just walk away or just turn around for a second or so. Some people are brilliant at this. And then coming back in again, I think is a really important thing. I think it's hugely underestimated. It's too easy to sit with the patient, holding on to something or doing something or focusing on something. If you find you've stopped for a moment or two and you're just about to move to the next thing, just stepping away and taking that time, I think, is a really important tool. Communication, we mentioned it, but thinking about what you say before you say it, picking the time to say it, things. And Owen, I could go on, I'm afraid, but I think I'll summarize by saying taking the time to step away and step back in is probably the biggest lesson I think I've seen people do well.
Listen, that's fantastic. And I'm just wholeheartedly in agreement there. Just from a fundamental acknowledgement that, like you said, we all have a finite capacity. And even if you don't feel like you've reached your capacity, but just giving yourself a little bit of mental space to think about the next 5 minutes, think about what needs to happen in 5, 10, 15 minutes. Recorrect your own physiology. I think this is something I learned a lot around breathing deeply and doing this box breathing just to trigger your own vagal system, so to slow your heart rate, to slow your breathing down and actually have clarity of thought, because we do know heart rate is associated with more erratic thinking and task execution. But listen, that's fantastic, Neil, and I think you're right. If people could just take one thing away, it's just stepping out and stepping back in and just taking the time to have clarity of thought, clarity of intention, and then clarity of execution is absolutely key. Thank you for the last hour. It's been really enjoyable just speaking to you, just running through some of these concepts, Neil, and just getting your anecdotal experience. So thank you.
It's my pleasure entirely, and I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about, but a pleasure to talk to you as always.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.